Looks like we're at time, so let me go ahead and start the webinar now. Thanks for joining us. It's a great time, but let's just give it 1 minute or so that everybody can join the webinar. Sometimes it takes Zoom a minute to let everybody in. Let's go ahead and get started. We have a packed show today. My name is Chinda Chun, and I'm with NACVA and the Consultants Training Institute. Before we get started with the around the valuation world today, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, to obtain CPE credit, you must answer all the poll questions that pop up on your screen during today's webinar. CPE is available for AVW subscribers. There is a link on a slide if you are interested in obtaining CPE credit for the webcast. If you have any questions during the webinar today, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, as those will be directed to the presenter. If you have any technical questions or questions about NACVA, please feel free to reach out to me through chat, and I can assist you with that. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Alina and Mel, who will get us started on the webcast today.
Thank you, Shanda. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are located. Today, we are starting our September show, and we have a great lineup. We are going to start with Michael Gregory. He is always doing industry headlines and industry updates, so great information. We are also going to have James and Kerrie Merrifield, and they are going to be talking about business interruption and lost profits. Great information, especially during this time of the year with everything that is happening, hurricanes, earthquake, and all that. So it's a great area to understand. Then we're also going to have be talking about economic updates. And Alan Zipp and the judges, one of our great sessions every week, every month that we have and people loved. And we are going to have Michael Mulder. He's going to be discussing federal and state case law summaries. And at the end, we're going to have Garrett Wagner. He's coming back with us during this show this month, and he's going to be talking about innovative knowledge for today's CPAs. And now we're going to start with our first segment, and we're going to have Mike Gregory. We all know him. He's a mediation and negotiation specialist. Working in different areas, he always mentioned that he is always available to assist, and he is saying that, and it's the truth. He is always available for us. So, hi, Mike. Thank you for being with us this month.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Elena. It's my pleasure to be here. We have a number of things we're going to be covering today. Takeaways from NACVA Super Conference that was in July, and just a plug about the next one is coming up here in December. Why should BV experts care about court cases? It's right on point with what Mike Mulder is going to be talking about today. Private sector companies optimistic per the McKinsey survey. Preview of the Appraisal Foundation's guidance on company-specific risk premiums. Some update on that. 2 closed-end fund reports for estimating discounts for lack of control are updated. DeModern updates his country risk analysis and provides both detail and a summary, which I'll bring to your attention. And the age-old idea still works for retaining good BV talent. So what do we want to do and make sure we're keeping people on board? In terms of objectives, we're going to identify the key takeaways from that NACVA Super Conference, recognize why BV experts should care about court cases, and Michael Mulder is going to be pointing that out to you here too. Recognize the McKinsey information on private sector update. Distinguish company-specific risk with an update from the Appraisal Foundation. Recognize the 2 new closed-end funds for determining DLAC. Identify what DeModern has to say about risk analysis, and choose methods to retain and to hire, train, and retain good BV talent. So from the Super Conference, I pulled out just a few things. Gray divorces are becoming more prevalent. So people who are older historically weren't necessarily as much oriented towards divorce. They're finding today that's becoming more prevalent as people are retiring. Both people are at home. One was working outside the home. Now they're both at home. Sometimes that can cause some friction. Consolidation trend is increasing. So there's more consolidation taking place with respect to a number of industries. For damage valuations, you want to ensure that you're matching the duration of your valuation with your discount rate duration, and that you realize your future years are more risky. And in that analysis, they're suggesting more than one discount rate as you're looking at future years. And more cases are going to mediation. I'm a mediator. I mediate 2 to 4 times every month. And I'm just commenting, yes, this is becoming required by the courts. And for people who have experience with BV and mediation, this is a definite uptrend. A veteran forensic expert concluded the US is insolvent and getting worse. I read that one and I thought, that's pretty scary. We talk about the risk-free rate being the safe rate. Well, if the entire US economy with the US government is insolvent, that's pretty major if that were to happen. When assessing artificial intelligence and environmental social governance, look to fundamentals unless they impact cash flow, risk, and growth as a BVer. The new DLOM calculator using the Margrave options approach is offered for beta testing. I had not heard of that before, so that's new to me. Young BV petitioners need to be appreciated through growth opportunities, assistance with obtaining their credentials, exposure to clients to know how to work with clients, ability to travel to conferences, just like the NACVA Super Conference, and opportunities to write sections on valuation reports and articles. So with that in mind, let's go through these one at a time. Steve Brunner at the Valuation Group, he provides the following commentator. Know your jurisdiction on how cases are normally handled. Know your judge and perspective, and tailor your report and testimony accordingly. Use these as marketing tools to attorneys. From my own experience in the federal arena, we always research the judge 6 months ahead of time. We tailored our report with a new report because we were providing the court with the most current information instead of a report that was several years old. And then no question, we told the attorneys at the DOJ and the US Tax Court with the IRS attorneys that this is what we were doing, how we approached that, and that brought more work into our function. In the private sector, this is what I'm advising folks as well. So understand how regulatory agencies may use these cases, and that just comes from folks sharing with you what they've learned in the regulatory environment. Private sector companies are optimistic per the McKinsey report. They do a detailed report every year, and they've responded back and saying the private sector respondents report that they see increases in profit, demand, and workforce prospects. The survey has interactive graphs that show the results by industry, and I have those as a reference for you in the references today. And looking at the Appraisal Foundation, guidance on the company specific risk premium. The Appraisal Foundation has a working group. They've been working on this for a while. The group is specifically focused on CRISP. There's a summary outline available in terms of what they're doing. And they're saying, do not just supply a number. Your report needs quantitative support. There's a number of models and they're listed there. And they're coming out and saying in their report that will be coming, valuation for financial reporting. There are a number of advisories out there. They're called Valuation in Financial Reporting, VFRs. And what they're going to recommend with the company-specific risk premium is another Valuation in Financial Reporting, a VFR, is coming on valuation. So you want to be looking for that. And I'm sure once that comes out, there'll be applications outside of financial reporting as well. 2 closed-end fund reports are available now for DLOCs. The first one deals with fixed income securities, and the second one deals with stocks and equity instruments. And as you can tell from the fixed income securities, these are for flips, these are for limited liability corps, and those that hold various other instruments that deal with money market funds, CDs, government bonds, municipal bonds, corporate bonds, other fixed income investments. And the second one is those who are taking a look at closed-end funds for common stocks, preferred funds, REITs, or other corporate equity instruments. And I have links to those in the back here as well. DeModern updates his country risk premium. DeModern, as you recall, is from New York University, Stern's School of Business. The 2023 edition that he comes out with each year comes out in July. That's now available. There will be a link in here to his 125-page report, but he also summarizes that 125-page report in a blog. So I also have a link to that blog. So you can download the 125-page report, keep that as a reference, but if you want to see what's in it, you can certainly read it. If you want to read a summary of it, you can take that from the blog. And then he also has links to spreadsheets, and he has a 30-minute video if you want to listen to the video of what he has to say. The age-old talent still works for retaining good BV talent. Ryan McCowan, who's with Doran and Mayhew, points out that if you want to hire, train, and retain good talent, you want to recognize employees when they accomplish something. So if they pass an exam, they become accredited senior appraiser with American Society of Appraisers, they become an ABV with the AICPA, they become a CVA with NACVA. When folks pass exams, you want to recognize them. You want to encourage them to be contributing to articles because that helps out the firm in terms of marketing and it helps out them getting some exposure. And then you can just go ahead, he recommends just go ahead and Google how to recognize people. And there's articles out there on appreciation and recognition, and you can work that with your employees. And then give your employees some opportunities. Give them opportunities for growth, for exposure, promoting, and also promoting work-life balance. You don't want folks to burn out. We were just talking with the folks on the conference call here that yes, we want to be busy, but we don't want to be busy to the point that we're being fatigued with what we're doing. So you need to have balance in life. And then there actually is a blog that's entitled Appreciation at Work. I put something on LinkedIn every day. And one of the places I have as a source is Appreciation at Work. They send out an article weekly, and about once or twice a month, I'll put one of their articles on my LinkedIn page for Appreciation at Work because they have lots of good ideas. Now, in terms of resources here today, here's the McKinsey survey. You can cut and paste that link. Here's the Appraisal Foundation Valuation and Financial Reporting Valuation Advisory. So they don't have the one out yet on the company-specific risk premium, but they have other ones that are available. And they're simply called these Valuation and Financial Reporting Valuation Advisories. And you can take a look at those reporting valuation advisories. Additional resources, here are both closed-end funds, the ones for fixed income securities and the one for stocks and equity investments. These can be used for discounts for lack of control. Here's DeModern's paper, 125-page paper. And like I said, there's also a blog that I've gotten in here, which is a summary of that if you just want to read the blog and reference the paper for future reference. And here's this Appreciation at Work blog. I commented, that's the name of it, Appreciation at Work. They come out with ideas, and I post those periodically because they have really good ideas on how to continually be looking to ways that you can appreciate others. Well, these are the sources that I look at each week. Excuse me. And you can tell BV Wire, BV Update, the Value Examiner, NACFA CTI training summaries, valuation products and summaries with Jim Hitchner, IRS notices and updates, and then other sources as well. And as Elena said at the beginning, by all means, feel free to contact me at any time. That's my phone number. That's my email address. And if I can help you in any way, feel free to do so. I'm more than happy to help you. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to you, Elena or Mel.
Thank you, Mike. And our first poll question is up. Thank you. Always, Michael, rich information that allows us to at least decide where we want to dig deeper. So I appreciate it. On to our next segment, we're going to talk about business interruption lost profits. And like Alina alluded to, I think this is a really hot topic given some of the Mother Nature happenings that have gone on of late. And James Ewart is going to have a guest, Kerrie Merrifield, talking through some of this. And James, I'm going to let you take it away and introduce your guest and go from there.
I certainly will. Thanks, Mel. And it's my privilege today to interview Kerrie. Kerrie is an accomplished forensic accountant who performs in a professional manner with integrity, respect, and most importantly, with knowledge, understanding, and competency in the areas that she practices, which she'll talk about. She's not a made-to-order expert, and I think we're going to get a lot from what she has to say today. Our objective is to review issues that we've identified as problematic particularly on the front end of a case when we get involved. And we hope that it's going to provide some thought-provoking information, but we also want it to be informative. So we're going to keep it pretty basic, but at the same time, we're going to get into some issues. Kerrie, good afternoon. How you doing?
I'm great, James, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
You're welcome. Can you give us just a brief overview of your practice and how it's evolved over the years? And one particular thing I know that I get asked all the time is, how did you get in this? So maybe you want to start there. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, it's kind of funny because I started out, until about 15 years ago, just doing your traditional accounting work, tax work. And I was doing some, work with this one CPA firm, and they happened to get in a case. It was like about 20 banker boxes. This was when everything was paper, about 20 banker boxes of paper stuff for this one case. And when I started it and doing it, I was like, oh my gosh, I love this. This is what I want to do. I've always liked accounting and stuff like that, but this was like, I found like my true love. So that's how I came into it, accidentally working on one case. And then ever since then, I've gone through and gotten several certifications and just exclusively worked in litigation since then. So Axiom Forensics has been around for about 15 years now. We offer expert witness services in conjunction with a variety of litigation support services. We specialize in business interruption, lost profit claims, business valuations, family law, complex civil litigation, and economic damages for employment matters and fraud investigations. I've personally worked on probably about over 600 matters so far and been qualified and testified as an expert witness in a couple dozen of these cases. Currently, I've been involved in and served on NACFA's Litigation Forensics Board and the Executive Advisory Board, and I'm working on several exciting projects now with NACFA and teach on several matters such as business interruption, lost profits, and matrimonial litigation. Wow.
When you first started, were you with a larger firm and then moved on to your own firm, or how did that happen?
No, it was with a smaller firm. There was maybe about 5 or 6 CPAs in the firm. Basically, they focused on tax, and it just happened to be a friend of one of the owners said, hey, can you help me out in this? You're a CPA, I just need some forensic accounting. So he gave it to me, and it was just happened by accident because they don't do litigation. So it was a smaller firm, and then I really wanted to focus more on that. They didn't want to, and so I just ended up opening up my own firm.
Yeah, it's a similar. I was with a smaller firm at one point, or a smaller office of a larger firm, really, I should say, and I kind of stumbled in it too, very young at the time, and so similar background. In preparing for this, we had a couple conversations, and we talked about the need to identify. I guess, and focus on certain aspects of cases and do that sooner rather than later. And I think you've got a couple of those type of things that you wanted to express today.
Yes, and specifically focusing on like business interruption, lost profit cases, the initial setup, as in any case, is very important. So one of the things I say before you start things is ask for the information. One of the most important documents you're going to get is going to be the insurance policy with the declaration page. So be sure that you read this and you understand it, because it can be a restaurant, but every policy is going to be individual for that business. So you're going to have different limitations, exclusions, coverages. And so if you're ever not sure, don't assume, always call the insurance company and ask. Also, make sure that you would do a site visit if you can, if it's safe. Take pictures, or, if the client has them and you're not able to get out there, get pictures. Speak with the owner of the business. They're going to be a very invaluable source of information, and gain an understanding of the history, the operations of that specific business itself. And then, be mindful and aware of things that will help the business
mitigate their damages. So you may be asked to help them. Hey, maybe you can need a temporary location if repairs are going to take a long time or things like that. And also often you're asked to be like kind of the communicator between the business owner and the insurance company, the adjuster, as far as, hey, are things on time? Are there delays? Because communication in these cases is critical. It can make a big difference. I would say also in business interruption loss profit cases, be sure that you're working with an attorney or a licensed adjuster. Don't work just with the client and the insurance company. You need to have an attorney or licensed adjuster involved in this. And yeah, so when I say setting up, I'd say probably that's one of the things. Also, just be aware that when you're doing this, before you start going in, to pay careful attention to things at the beginning of the period, of the loss period, and at the end of the loss period. And that would be things like taking into account revenues that were incurred or received and expenses incurred at the beginning of the period, but maybe paid but that belong to a prior period. And at the end of the period, that revenue earned and expenses incurred, although not paid, are going to be included. So that's something kind of unique to the business interruption loss profits cases that you're going to want to keep in mind at the very beginning of your engagement. And just be able to understand also not only the individual business itself, but be knowledgeable about the industry. Are there any kind of unique accounting features, such as dealing with inventory, or is the revenue recognized over a period of time? Those things. So know the business as well as the industry before you start doing your analysis.
Those are good points. Having I guess the licensed person involved with the case. Do you have that in every case, or just when you're being represented by or you're representing or retained by the insurance company?
If that's a business interruption loss case, if I'm not on the side of the insurance company, so on the side of the claimant,
right,
then make sure that there's an attorney or a public adjuster involved. If I'm working on that side, it's not going to be the same if sometimes in other cases, other than business interruption cases, I've gotten hired by the attorney directly because they want to know, hey, maybe there's fraud going on in their business before they even hire an attorney. Once it gets to a certain point, of course, I have them hire an attorney, but in business interruption loss cases, you want to make sure that if you're not on the side of the insurance company, that you're working with an attorney or a licensed adjuster.
Okay, yeah, because most of my work is coming through attorneys,
Right.
and returning, referrals from them. And I don't believe that I've actually worked for, been retained by the licensed adjuster.
Yeah, another thing I would kind of, if people are new in this business, whether it be business interruption, lost profits, or any kind of litigation work, is I've learned, make sure you work on a retainer basis, just like the attorney does. So before you start any work, get your signed engagement letter and get a retainer up front before you start your work, and then replenish that retainer along the way. Unless you've worked with the attorney, who's the engaging party and not the client, you have a history with them and okay, yes, they're very good on paying. So that's one thing I would also say to do at the beginning of your engagement.
Yeah, I think that's probably something we've learned pretty early in our careers in this area, is make sure that we're going to be able to get paid. Because I'm sure we've all had issues from time to time in collecting. So particularly if the case has not gone particularly the way they wanted it to go.
Exactly.
We talked about, what I refer to as the good, the bad, the ugly in cases. So what kind of lessons have you learned along the way? Because I know that when I see the ugly, I know that helps teach me to do some things maybe differently, or at least be more aware. So what of those have you kind of learned along the way that stick out, that just jump out to you to do or be aware of?
Yeah, and also I'll start off on a positive note and say, one of the good things I've seen is collaborative work between experts. Because we know, experts we should not be adversarial. Even though we're engaged by opposing counsel, we're an advocate for the facts, not for the clients. And that often gets lost in a case. So often in divorce cases and other cases, the judge orders like a meet and confer, where the two forensic CPAs or the two CPAs get together and work through whatever issues you can to take things off the table that you can agree upon. That's one good thing that I've seen, is being collaborative, because as I said, we don't want to be a paid mouthpiece. That's the last thing you want to have a reputation for. So you're just an advocate for the facts. On the bad and the ugly parts, there's two really major things that I've seen, unfortunately. One is too often experts that have been in this for a very long time and they have a name and they have that reputation. They've come to rely on their name and reputation to kind of carry them through and give their testimony more weight in court. And then in reviewing the work, I've often seen like they've just kind of gotten more sloppy, a level of sloppiness or disregard for utilizing accepted methods, or performing due diligence and even gathering sufficient relevant data. And not because they aren't good at what they do, they just become more complacent with time. So that's one thing I've seen, kind of as the bad and the ugly. And the other I would say is experts that appear to be more on the other end of the spectrum, not qualified. So maybe they've gotten their certifications and they've taken all the exams and education, but they've never had that type of supervision or experience. And so, their testimony may be very weak. Their analysis might not be an accepted methodology, or sometimes I've seen like data sources pulled for cases from somebody's blog or some study in some unknown country 20 years ago, things like that. So I would say those are like kind of two of the major issues that I've seen, or also, unfortunately, when you can tell that the expert is an advocate for the client and not the facts.
Yeah, and this collaborative side of things, I know in the areas and the geographic areas that I work in, I'm seeing more and more of that, where the attorneys are permitting us to be able to sit down and have those conversations. But it's not ordered by the courts. At least I'm not aware of it happening in the jurisdictions that I've worked. So it may be, what areas are you working? Let's what geographic territory are you in that may be a little ahead of things?
I'd say the majority of my cases are in California, more focusing in Southern California. And a lot of, when I say the meet and confers, most of them are in family law. So
well, that's for sure. Yeah, no question about that. In the family law, yeah, that's one area where collaboration has gotten much better. We still have the issues associated with advocacy, but that's just, I think, part of what we do, and I really appreciate your opening comments about the need to make sure that we're focused on facts and not objectives, particularly as it relates to the attorneys. I know that the court recently rendered one of your opinions where the opposing well, I guess the best way to say this is that the opposing expert's opinion was not well received by the court. And I think there's, with the remaining time that we have, and we have about, 6 minutes, maybe you could explain how one is perceived in the courtroom and certainly on the stand, and how that weighs on either the jury or the judge for a bench case.
Yes. Actually, this is a business interruption lost profits case that I had earlier this year in Los Angeles, and it was against a major insurance company. And the insurance company's expert, he had testified that he had worked on thousands of business interruption cases and prepared spreadsheets for the insurance company, which he called his business interruption loss profit analysis. And in this analysis, which was just based on bank statements and tax returns, he had found a $0 loss for this business that had been completely closed for a 12-month period. Of course, first, just looking at it, it's not plausible given that the business was closed 12 months in a row. He never interviewed the business owner. He did not visit the site and to get an understanding of how this business operated. So in this business, it takes about 18 months to collect the revenue from the initial sale. And in this case, it was really important to have like an in-person working center. It was for a company that had products imported from other countries for kitchen cabinets, cupboards, appliances, any kind of like home renovations. They did a lot of residential as well as commercial building projects. And so since he had never talked to this person, he did not really understand the intricacies of this business. So he treated the bank statements for that year that they were closed as income for that year. And he said, nope, they had a $0 loss because look, they had money coming in. The expert made 0 adjustments for income earned or the expenses paid or incurred at the beginning and ending of the periods. He didn't ask about anything. He didn't calculate any extra expenses, of which there were tens of thousands, and the insurance policy did cover them. So this was an expert that said he had done thousands of claims with this insurance company before. So he's, not new with this. He was very, very arrogant in his demeanor in court when testifying and otherwise, which I'll touch on in a second. So, in turn, the judge in her minute order gave his testimony analysis 0 weight. The expert did not perform a business interruption loss profits calculation in any sense of the word. So instead of it, we had made a motion to exclude this witness, but the judge didn't think it was her place to tell an expert whether he could testify or not, but the court would decide what weight to give his testimony. In this case, it turned out to be 0. The insurance company's expert was also really critical of the adjustments that I had made for income earned and expenses incurred during the loss period, saying that small companies don't use GAAP. We had a whole bunch of testimony on what GAAP was and who uses it and the reasons for it and everything. The insurance policy language was really clear on including expenses incurred and income earned during the loss period. And the court also awarded his testimony on the criticisms 0 weight. But one thing is, lastly, it's something we don't talk about really often when we talk about expert witnesses and testifying in court is courtroom behavior. And in this case, there's nothing I can say written to say, okay, this affected her opinion, but I'm sure it did to some extent because the expert at the very beginning of the case, this was in March of this year in LA, and the judge was very explicit on her instructions in her courtroom as always having a mask on before entering the courtroom. And if you wanted to even take a sip of water, you needed to leave her courtroom, go outside, and then come back in. This expert who had sat behind me got scolded in the period of 2 days, was scolded 3 times by the bailiff for not having his mask on in the courtroom. She reported this to the judge, and then he also ignored the judge's strict orders of no cell phones even to be on in her courtroom, not even if they're on silent, only the attorneys could do that. And if you didn't abide by her rules, she would confiscate your phone. So on the second time in 2 days that the expert was caught by the bailiff on his cell phone, she confiscated the cell phone, gave it to the judge. When the judge came back from her break, the judge gave this expert a little talking to, saying that, this was her house and she expected him to abide by her rules as the same as if she were to go to his house to abide by his rules. So she was not happy with that. And so the last thing you want to do when you go into the courtroom, just little things like that, has nothing to do with the case, nothing to do with the testimony, is you don't want to offend the judge and give her the impression that you are above her rules and you can do as you please. because that can give the judge the impression that, you might apply these same kind of standards to your work and your work ethic. Now, this alone probably didn't affect the weight of his testimony, but in this case, where there was doubt or there is, kind of a debate on, if he uses approved methods, did he follow this standard, follow that standard, this can sway the needle when the judge sees how you act, and you don't have a regard for standards and you don't have a regard for rules, how that can apply to your work. So as a result of the sloppiness, his lack of due diligence and lack of methodology and having sufficient relevant data, the court awarded the client all of the lost income and all of the extra expenses in my analysis. So, as I said, it's not going to be put in writing, but your behavior in the courtroom, and the judge sees everything, whether she says it or not, she sees everything, can affect you as an expert when you testify.
Yeah. Great advice. Great advice. So with that, we'll conclude, and I guess we'll go back to Mel.
Okay, thank you.
Oop, Alina.
James and Kerrie, thank you for all that information. Kerrie is excellent. And everyone, we have our polling question in front of you, so make sure you respond to that. And also, we have information about the next super conference. It's going to be in Fort Lauderdale, December 14 and 15. And you will have in-person registration and also virtual registration. So make sure you do your registration for the conference, especially if you want to learn new information and you need CP credits, like myself, always at the end. So just make sure you register. And also it's a network experience that is great to just join your our colleagues and we talk about. And now we are going to have our next session, and we're going to talk about economics. So we have Simon Rubinsohn with us. He's going to be talking, as I mentioned, about economics. He's the chief economist at the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. He began a 15 plus tenure with the RICS after serving as senior studies at Barclays Wealth, and he has been with us before. So thank you for joining us.
Well,
and you can take it from here.
Yeah, thank you, Alina, and good morning, everyone. I think this was meant to be a conversation, but unfortunately, my co-conspirator in this was unable to be present. So I think you're now going to just have a presentation for me. So I apologize if it feels a bit one-dimensional. But hopefully, and I would really like it if people were able to participate in the session. It's not going to be a long session. It's about 20 minutes or so. But I'd really welcome comments, feedback, and certainly questions. And I'm happy to take questions as we go through the session, or perhaps I will leave a few minutes at the end where we can perhaps delve a little bit more deeply into some of the issues. But essentially what I'm trying to do, I suppose, is provide a bit of a framework to think about the outlook for business valuation going forward, and looking at how the macro dimension might impact on that. So without further ado, let me just roll forward and just begin to sort of start the conversation. As I say, really interested to get your thoughts as we move through the session. But I think there is only one place to start when we consider issues around the outlook, macro outlook, and that is really inflation. I know Alina mentioned that I had actually had talked to you previously, and I think we'd probably touched on inflation, but I think there were other issues which also were perhaps influencing our thoughts about the macro outlook, and also how that would play out in terms of value in the valuation world. But I think now it seems to me, from my perspective, that the focus is very much on this issue. Concerns about, for example, banking-related problems have certainly diminished, and we might touch on that as we move through this session. So where are we on this whole issue of inflation? And you're probably aware this is another big week, of course, when it comes to the responses to inflation. I'll also touch on that shortly. Let me start with the US, but I'm going to sort of broaden this out. It won't just be a US story. If we think about what's happened over the last short while, look at the headline rate, that blue line. It's been coming down pretty sharply, as we all know. It hit a peak of around the 9% area. It has fallen pretty sharply, but actually the August reading, and you're probably aware of this, the August reading came out just a week or so ago, that actually saw a bit of a surprise. So the month-on-month number came out at 0.6, which was more than anticipated by pretty much everyone. And that was reflected when you look at it in year-on-year terms, with a slight bump upwards. So we saw the headline rate move back towards the 4% area, not quite getting there, but back towards. The main reason for this was higher gasoline prices, and I'm going to come on to that one, another issue I'm going to come on to shortly. The orange line, in a way, is the more important line because that is this core rate that's often talked about, and it strips out some of the more volatile elements. It has its faults. It's not, it is heavily influenced by certain parts of the basket, but nevertheless, it gives a better feel for the direction of travel. And the good news in August was that continued to soften. As you can see here, we're now down at about just over 4.5%, just over 4%. And the trend seems to be a fairly consistent one. So the inflation story seems to be improving, notwithstanding this August blip for the headline number, but we still seem to have some way to go till we can feel entirely comfortable with where we are. And when we look at what's going on elsewhere around the advanced world or the more mature economies, however you want to describe them, actually the picture is not dissimilar. You can see that grain line at the top. That's the UK, and the UK's been a bit of an outlier in terms of where it's been on inflation. It touched a higher peak than many, and it's a bit slower to come down, but it does now seem to be following the general trend. The blue line there you can see is the euro area, and that has been coming down fairly sharply. Again, seems to perhaps be leveling off a little bit. We take on board what we said about the headline rate in the US. These are all headline rates, I stress. And you can also there see the Canada line in red, stroke orange. I think it's a red to me. And it actually picked up a little bit last time, again, like the US number, and actually moved back above 3%, which is an important level as far as the Bank of Canada is concerned. And there you can see Japan. Now, the Japan number at about just over 3%, 3.2%, you might say that's low, but let's remember the context of Japan. Japan's been experiencing zero or inflation or deflation for a couple of decades. So the fact that inflation's even got up to the sort of 4% area is quite an amazing story in itself and really broken the long-term trend. But, in pretty much every case, what I'm using these two charts to show is there's a fairly similar story emerging. Now, I mentioned earlier gasoline prices. And that is a bit of a story that we need to be mindful of and keep a watch on when we're thinking about, how this might all play out in terms of the triggers that could lead to a positive environment for business valuation as opposed to a negative environment. Oil prices have picked up pretty smartly. This is West Texas Intermediate. You can see the increase there, pushing above $80 a barrel and actually reaching its highest level since the back end of last year. So no mean feat, really. Now, we can look at specific reasons for, we can look at, sorry, I'm just going to go back because someone's raised an issue and I'm just going to have a quick look. Sorry, I think I'm So on Japan, just looking at the Japanese inflation rate, the latest reading should actually be, I don't know if someone misinterpreted that because they said 2%. It is actually around the 3% mark, just over 3% mark, just to reiterate that point, the latest reading. So going forward again, and I meant, we talked about oil prices, and we said it was pretty much a 10-month high. And I was going to just talk about the reasoning why the reason why it had climbed. I think there have been issues around supply from Saudi Arabia. There are ongoing issues around Russia, and I think that has contributed again more recently. And we've had the flooding in Libya as well. So that has provided the boost that we've seen over the last few weeks or so. And it's not, it isn't limited to one type of crude. Brent is doing exactly the same thing. What I think is providing me with some reassurance that this isn't going to be a generalized, uplift in inflation is what's happening to other commodity prices. So if one looks at the futures index covering metals, which is the blue line, or the futures index, the forward index looking at agricultural products, you can see that there hasn't been any material change in direction of late. Now, that I think is really quite significant. And I had a quick look at individual commodities just to reassure myself today. And I looked at the copper price, and actually copper prices are continuing to slip. They're actually at their lowest level since the beginning of the year, which again probably is quite notable, really. It's sort of telling you something about what's happening in terms of demand for metals. And I also had a look at wheat prices. Wheat prices were amongst those sort of prices that got really pushed up during COVID. And wheat prices, if anything, are falling even faster, or seeing a bigger decline than copper. So I think that the fact that we're not seeing metals prices, we're not seeing food prices begin to climb as well, tells me that this is quite specific. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a potential problem, but I've been looking also at a lot of research around the impact of oil prices. And, and I'm sure you're aware of some of this debate. Oil prices work in two ways. One is inflation, but it also crimps the purchasing power of households and indeed businesses. So it can be both inflationary and stroke deflationary. And in the current environment, with demand, and we'll come on to that in a second, still relatively subdued, I think the without it being a generalized trend, and I don't think there's going to be the continual momentum to drive further increases in oil prices. And I'm not without, I don't think it's without risk, but I feel relatively comfortable we're not going to see another kick to the inflation cycle. But I think it is something that we do need to keep a watchful eye on. I mentioned what's going on in the economy, and I think, against, inflation is one element in the story. And, one of the other elements clearly is what's happening in terms of the sort of economic growth environment. And that feeds in at some level, obviously, also to what's happening in terms of inflation. There's been lots of recessionary talk this year, and I'm going to have to hold my hands up at this point and say that, I was, sort of probably in previous conversations with you talking about the risk of recession. What's in a way surprised me, and I have to say, I think it's probably surprised others as well, is that despite the scale of the interest rate shock, economies have just about kept their head above water. Now, that's to varying degrees, and it's not been particularly, an enjoyable ride so far. It's been troubled, but we haven't had the contraction and activity that might have been and indeed was anticipated. So, to what extent can we feel reassured about the macro sort of growth environment? Well, Oxford Economics have just released their latest Global Business Sentiment Index. And interestingly, that continues to creep upwards. So there does seem to be some positivity amongst business leaders out there. That now stands at 98. It moved up from 97.6 in July. And it's actually the highest reading since the start of the year. So I think that is encouraging. But, I still wouldn't get carried away about the prospects. And, I don't want to be sort of particularly downbeat. And, you've got lots of, interesting technical discussions. And the last thing you want is an economist giving you a gloomy overview. But I think it is going to take a bit of time to get up through this whole set of challenges that we still face. And, I was just trying to get a feel for where the consensus is in terms of the growth outlook for what's called the advanced economies. Last year, 2022, I think growth on average amongst the advanced economies was about 2.6%. For this year, what I'm seeing is a consensus number of around 1.5%. So again, not that bad in the circumstances. For 24, the consensus is actually a little lower. It's somewhere between 0.5 and 0.1 and 0.5 and 1%. And I think that's partly the legacy of the tightness of monetary policy through the course of this year. And so they say the knock-on effects of that going through into at least the first half of next year. Now, of course, these are year on years, and that is always a bit, misleading because the profile is really important. And I suspect that what we will see is activity begin to pick up during the course of next year. And, those base effects, which are dragging down the annual number, will actually become less relevant. And we will see the profile pick up through the second half of 2024. But, in the meantime, it's still going to be a relatively subdued environment. Now, what we are seeing is some signs that labour markets are losing momentum. And they're not falling out of bed. We're not seeing sharp rises in unemployment. But you can see from looking at this US employment non-payrolls data that the numbers have slackened somewhat. They're still positive. They're still reasonably, respectively positive. But compared with where we were through much of last year, they're running at a lower rate, and certainly even compared with the first half of this year. So, that's indicative, I think. And, if I look at other advanced economies, I look at the UK, I look at parts of Europe, I'm seeing just unemployment rates just tick up in a very small way. But all said and done, this is still a job-rich downturn. Jobs are still there. I think the important point about a slight slackening in the tightness of labour market is that should help to consolidate the downward pressure on core inflation. One of the challenges is obviously if you have exceedingly tight markets is you tend to get obviously a lot of wage pressures coming through, and that can lead, help to fuel that wage price spiral, which keeps sort of core inflation elevated for longer. I think that the slight slackening that we're seeing now will help to at least sort of take some of the pressure out of the valve there and allow those sort of wage pressures to begin to ease, and that hopefully, as I say, will feed through into a continual downward trend in core inflation. Now, I wanted to just say a quick word on China before I come back to the advanced economies, just because I think it's important to ensure that we don't become too obviously fixated with one part of the world. And China has obviously a huge role that it plays in terms of driving activity across much of APAC, as well as the influence it has across the more mature economies. Now, after that, and I think we talked about this last time, we had something of a sort of a sugar rush in that first part of this year, the end of COVID, the end of lockdown. There was a real spending spree. Growth really accelerated. Q2 was a lot quieter. the government has responded, but it's responded in a slightly different way to normal. It's not pulled the traditional sort of policy levers that it's done in the past. There's not been that big infrastructure spend. I mean, I think it's been very mindful that the sort of levers it's pulled in the past have indeed contributed to some of the problems that it's now encountering, whether it's about sort of the housing market specifically or construction more generally. And I think it's been much more judicious in the way it's approaching this. But the fact that it's not going in with the big boosters, and you can see that from this particular chart, because this is investment in fixed assets. It suggests that the trend now is actually still, in terms of year-on-year terms, edging lower rather than moving higher. And you might have, if there was obviously this is slightly distorted by what happened in the COVID period, but if you might have expected to see a big boost upwards, which would be typical of what happens, it happened in the past when the government was looking to really provide renewed stimulus. So you haven't got that this time. So what does that mean? Well, the sort of more modest measures that the government has been playing around with look likely to provide, as you would expect, a more modest level of boost to the economy. And now the target is 5% for this year, but my suspicion is that that's going to be a bit of a stretch. And I think going forward, China is focusing on probably higher quality growth, but lower numbers. So we're probably not going back to the 7-8% that China enjoyed, and that benefited much of the world in the past. It's a very different environment as China's concerned, and I would suggest that some of the risks are still skewed, or the main risks are still skewed on the downside, reflecting some of those big pressure points, particularly around housing, and indeed around the banking and finance sector, which remain unresolved. So having said all that about China, I now want to return for the end of this presentation to, in a sense, what's happening this week and beyond. You'll be aware there's a Fed meeting. The outcome of the Fed meeting is going to be closely watched. It is conceivable we could still see another Fed rate rise. I think the betting is that the pause that people have talked about will hold, that there won't be a move at this point. That doesn't mean the peak is reached. There'll obviously be lots of excitement and interpretation that this is the top. It probably is. But, obviously one does have to be mindful about what's going on in the oil market and how that might feed through into inflation and how the Fed might interpret that. But aside from the actual outcome, I think there are two other things to watch at least two other things to watch very carefully. First of all, the statement, and the statement is always very nuanced, but their changes of words can mean quite a lot. Secondly, the economic projections, because this is one of those meetings where the economic forecasts for the economy are reviewed, so worth watching those. And then, of course, the dot plot. Now, I've got here the dot plot. This is what the median expectation of the FOMC members is for interest rates, the Fed funds rate, looking out to 2025 and beyond. And you can see that they were looking at something like, rates being where they are this year, then beginning to come down in 2024. They had a median reading of 4.75%, 25, a median reading of 3.5%, and then this sort of longer term, which might be interpreted as something like a neutral rate, 2.5%. So this is going to be something that we're going to be looking at closely when the Fed makes its announcement. I think it's worth being a little bit cautious about the turning point and how far rates are going to come down in the foreseeable future. I do believe we're at the peak, but if you look at the Jackson Hole comments from Jerome Powell, and I'm sure you've all seen this, he talks about, intending to hold policy at a restrictive level until we're confident that inflation is moving sustainably down. Very clear. Interestingly, last week, the ECB actually raised rates. I'm sure you saw that. The statement talked about maintaining for a sufficiently long duration interest rates to make a substantial contribution for the timely return of inflation to target. So they're both, of these major central banks talking about the need to see inflation moving sustainably in a downward direction. And I think they are mindful of mistakes that have been made in the past. And I know that sometimes, people's memories are short, and we haven't perhaps had an inflation shock like this for a while. But I think for central banks, they'll be thinking back to when they've perhaps turned policy around too quickly and fueled a reigniting of inflationary pressures. So I wouldn't be expecting very much too soon. And I think that is probably fairly now in the consensus, but I think there's good reasons for that. Finally, if rates are going to begin to fall in 2024 and probably around the middle of 2024, what is the new normal? What is the equilibrium? Where are we heading to? Well, it's conceivable, of course, and you can see from this cycle here that, you could go an awful long way down. But if you're looking about what is the equilibrium rate, what is a reasonable rate to look towards as a neutral rate? Well, there's been a number of Fed papers out around this and discussing whether or not, there are reasons post-COVID, whether the neutral rate might have changed. My gut feel is that we're looking at something around the 3% mark as a neutral rate. You can see that, Fed governors were talking about the longer term 2.5% from this past slide. It may be a bit lower as well. But I think that if one looks at, the inflation target of around 2% and builds in sort of something to reflect productivity growth as well, something in the ballpark of 3% is not unreasonable. That said, if interest rates do fall, albeit gradually from their current level of around 5.5% to the 3 to 3.5% area over a couple of years, which I think is quite conceivable if the inflation picture does improve or continue to improve along the lines I've suggested, then I think you could be looking at an environment, which is quite supportive both for bond markets and indeed for equity valuations. So it may just not be quite there yet, and we may have, perhaps not a sticky end to the year, but it may not be a particularly exciting end to this year, and indeed the first half of next year. But one can see the conditions falling into place, hopefully, where as we move through into 24, the picture does indeed begin to improve, and we are able to look forward to a somewhat brighter environment. So I'm going to finish there and just check out whether there are any questions that are worth having a quick look on. So something about quantitative easing. Look, it's actually quantitative tightening underway now, and I think that what you're going to see is a continuing reining back of that liquidity, and that's part of the adjustment process. So we are going to see that, yes, it is the Fed funds rate. So that's the other response to that. So I better hand you back. Is it to Alan now?
No, well, it will be to Alan, but it'll be to me first. Thank you, Simon.
Okay, I'm going to hand you over. Okay. Thank you very much for listening.
It's always fascinating to start to look at the views from around the globe and what's really happening, and versus listening to the media. So
thank you.
Absolutely. So we're going to move to our next segment with Alan Zipp. This is actually, this is one of the most popular segments of the program. Always is the conversations with the judges. Alan has done this segment numerous times. He's got a wealth of knowledge in not just the valuation, but the litigation and the process of litigation. So, Alan, I'm going to hand it over to you. You can introduce the esteemed panel of judges. And take it away and talk about the context, which we're going to be talking about, man.
Very good. Thank you, Mel. Am I on the screen? Because I can't see me. You can see
me?
I see you. No slides, but we usually just put a title slide up.
All right. I will share my screen and click that and see if that works. I guess not.
It's coming up. You're good.
Oh, okay.
It's starting. Here you go.
Well,
now we see it.
All right, let me current slide. Excellent. I got it. Judge Driscoll will not be with us today because of his schedule. So I understand that Judge Platt and Judge Yates are going to quote him without any fact checking.
Right.
Notwithstanding, we're going to talk today about how effective experts best serve the litigants, counsel, and triers of fact. This is a very, very complex issue. And you all are going to do an hour in depth on this following the around the Valuation World today. So I'm just going to get it started, and I'm going to throw a number of different thoughts out for discussion. And I enjoy these judges. They're incredibly perceptive of our work that we do. So I'm just going to skip through the preliminaries here and ask you this. Let's start with litigation consulting services separately of offering an opinion. But the first question would be, is it advisable for the business valuation expert to offer independent consulting services to facilitate a settlement? And then when the expert is retained to offer an opinion of value, is there a role the expert could serve in settlement negotiations? Judge, please, whoever's first.
You want to go first, Steve, or you want me?
Let's give Judge Platt first, because he's from my neighborhood.
Okay.
A little hometown justice.
Yeah, he picks on me when I'm in court with him. I remember those days.
My answer to both questions is yes. And doesn't mean that answer is without any thought, but as long as everybody understands, and this is true in any context, what role you're playing and who's paying you and where you're coming from, the question of, is it advisable for the business valuation expert to offer independent consulting services to facilitate settlement? Who are you offering those services to and for, is question number one. And if the answer is clear to everyone and no one has any issues with that, I don't see a reason not to answer the question, is it advisable? It's advisable if everybody agrees to it and there isn't an issue. I'm not sure what the issue would be, as long as the transparency is there. And if the transparency is there and there's still no issue, then the only objection could be after they don't like the opinion. Then is there a role the expert could serve in settlement negotiations when the expert is retained to offer an opinion of value? And the answer is, again, is the transparency there? Is the role being played agreeable to everybody? And if it isn't agreeable, why isn't it agreeable? So that's my answer, which raises a lot of other questions. I think the answer to these two questions is that it raises other questions, and they all have to be answered in order to answer the original threshold inquiry.
Excellent. Judge Yates?
Yeah, I would amplify everything that Judge Platt said and offer a couple more thoughts on that. One of the greatest dangers that anybody involved in litigation can have is wearing two hats that put you in conflict. Anytime there's a risk of that, you really should have only one role, and that's it. But as Judge Platt says, particularly in commercial litigation, we all are amenable to interesting suggestions about how to resolve things, but everything needs to be done with eyes wide open and with everybody in full understanding of what the agreements are. Let me give you an example. In a couple of cases, when I was a business court judge, the parties chose, for confidentiality reasons and other concerns, to proceed to arbitration rather than to have a bench trial, but they wanted me to be the arbitrator. Now, that put me in a very difficult situation, and I had to get everybody to sign off in advance on it because I understood the value of arbitration, but I also understand that I get paid by the state of Michigan, and I have to be careful about what I'm doing and that I'm not being compensated for something for which I ought not be compensated, or that I could put myself in an impossible situation. So in those circumstances, I had everybody sign off on an agreement to arbitrate, and I signed off on it as well, with all of our roles very strictly defined. And then and only then was I willing to act as an arbitrator. I would say the same thing for a business valuation expert to offering independent consulting services to facilitate a settlement. If you have no other role in the case, then you are merely an outsider coming in to provide a valuable service to the court. And that's all to the good. But if, for example, you're an expert for one side and you decide that you're probably as good as anybody at settling the case because you know it so well, and you can devote a lot more time to it than the judge could in a settlement conference, and you offer, therefore, to step in and try to run a settlement conference, you're creating a fundamental conflict that you don't want to have. So I guess my answer to the first question is, if you're a stranger to the litigation, by all means, you can offer those services. But if you have any role in the litigation, I would be pretty unwilling, if I were the person contemplating acting as an independent consultant, to try to involve myself with a second title in the course of the litigation. Excellent. And then as to the second question, we've talked about that a lot. There's definitely a role an expert could serve in settlement negotiations when the expert's retained to offer an opinion of value. I think Judge Platt and Judge Driscoll and I have all made very clear that we not only welcome, but strongly encourage of experts like you in settlement negotiations. It just makes things so much easier for us to understand, for the parties to understand, and even for retaining counsel to understand.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Good. You know, here is a list of things that I do as a consulting expert when I'm not retained to offer an opinion of value, and I'd like to get your discussion on that. But just to go through these, I advise clients and counsel of the advisability of even pursuing the case and what the likely outcome would be. Also advising the client and counsel of the weaknesses in the opposing party's case, and then providing expert witness testimony in court regarding valuation issues and standards of care and the standards that we follow. Could you discuss these as your thoughts? Not offering an opinion of value here.
Right. I'll take this one first because I have strong feelings about this. This is one of these situations where the legal system benefits greatly from parties and attorneys going to experts to try to get a realistic take on the case. And as a result of that, we judges pretty jealously guard these sorts of relationships when a retaining counsel goes out and reaches out to an expert, not to testify as an expert witness, but simply to take a look at the case and offer an analysis of it. We generally make those sorts of communications completely off limits. And besides that, we prohibit the other side from calling such a non-identified expert as a witness or even trying to depose the person. So that's all to the good, and the system really likes what you're suggesting in the first two bullet points. The third bullet point, providing expert witness testimony in court regarding valuation issues. What I'd say about that is, once you make the turn from being an advisor to being a proposed expert witness, you open up your whole file to discovery. And so you have to keep that in mind. As long as you're willing to do that, and your retaining counsel is willing to take that obligation and perhaps take the risks that go with it, I don't have any problem with that either.
I would just add to that, I'll cite my own experience in the last decade. Twice, I have, the services that somebody that does what I do offers is arbitration, mediation, and neutral, and what's referred to as neutral case evaluation, where you're hired by one side or the other, and occasionally by both sides by an agreement to, quote, neutrally evaluate the case. One, you have to make sure nobody thinks you have a conflict. And when in doubt, you have a conflict. And secondly, And the one experience that I'll cite is I actually got hired to do a neutral case evaluation for one party through their lawyer and with them, sat down with them and evaluated the case in the manner that Judge Yates just described, advising the client and counsel the weakness in the opposing party's case, advising the client of the advisability, another way of saying the strengths of their own case. Once you do that, then I got then called by the other side and asked if I could mediate that case. And I said no, because I've already done a neutral case evaluation for the other side, and everything they said to me was confidential. And the answer was, we know that. And I said, well, I actually told them they had, with I checked back with them, and I said, I actually told them they had a fairly good case. We know, that's why we want to hire you.
Well, can the expert,
the client needs to hear what you told the other side. The other side doesn't have any problem with you hearing, with them hearing what you told them. I was still apprehensive for all the reasons that Judge Yates just mentioned. I actually drew up my own agreement again, which was a modification of anything I'd ever done before, in which they waived every which way imaginable, every kind of confidentiality, and anything that even could remotely be raised as an issue after the fact. My instinct was not to do it at all. I did do it, and there was never any repercussions from it. So the bottom line of that is, again, transparent. If you're going to do anything like that, particularly if you're going to switch roles, you better do a really comprehensive written agreement with all parties and counsel, bringing them on board to exactly who you are, what your role is, what your process is, and what the history is, so that there could be no allegation whatsoever of any kind of foul play or lack of fairness.
Well done. What are your thoughts on engaging the expert as a mediator to settle the business valuation conflict of values, and or even a consultant to the mediator in the case?
I would start by saying everything Judge Platt just said at the end of his answer, his most recent answer, applies with full force here as well.
Good.
Again, if everything's disclosed, if everybody's proceeding with eyes wide open, and if there's a written agreement authorizing you to essentially take on a second role, it's okay. But just be very careful about that, because once you are hired by one side as an expert for that side, and I think that's what the first bullet point is asking, you have work product responsibilities, you have accountant-client privilege responsibilities, you have all sorts of obligations that are going to really be put in tension if you start to act as a mediator, because then you're trying to work extensively with both sides to bring them to a number that everyone can accept. I think it's less of a risk if you are a consultant to the mediator. In other words, you're not the one doing the mediation yourself. But again, all those duties with regard to work product and accountant-client privilege and all of that still are at play, and you don't ever want to be accused of violating those professional duties by taking on the role of a mediator and going and talking with the other side to try to work with them to come to a number.
I would
go ahead.
agree.
Go ahead, Judge Platt. I'd rather have you pick it up from here, because I have the same feelings I think that you do.
I think that the other thing that again was said, but is this whole business of dual roles and changing roles. Can't emphasize enough the transparency that is involved. And in the case of expert witnesses, sort of like lawyers, there's litigation around the country, although not as much now as there used to be, on what are the ethical obligations of a lawyer who becomes a mediator, because the mediators have their own ethical obligations, and the lawyers have their own. And one of the legal issues is, you act as a mediator, are you also subject to the canons of ethics for lawyers? Same would be true with a CPA. So you got to make sure you're in compliance with everybody, not only every role you're playing, but the ethical obligations that apply to you. And the question is, are you always bound by the canons of ethics for as a lawyer, even when you're not acting as somebody's lawyer, you're acting as a mediator or an arbitrator? Right. And it's unsettled in some places, but that applies to anybody who otherwise functions and provides services that they're not providing in this case, but they are in that business. And the best way to solve that problem is to spell it out in writing and have it very clear for everybody. And if anybody suggests there might be an issue, discretion would indicate not worth it.
The last line of that is that a consulting expert really should not be offering an opinion of value, because you're becoming an advocate for the client. And my question would be, how far can the expert go when offering consulting services to the party and counsel before becoming an advocate? Is there a bright line, or is it just an issue that should not be approached, one or the other?
I think if you're going to provide consulting services and your understanding going in is that you're simply providing consulting services and you will never, under any circumstances, appear on the witness stand as an expert, you should feel free to do whatever you think best serves the attorney and the client you are assisting as a consultant. But to me, the clear line of demarcation when you talk about the second bullet point and how far can the expert go in offering consulting services to the party and counsel before becoming an advocate for the client, to my mind, you become at least you can be accused of being an advocate for the client once you're named as an expert witness. So once your name appears on a witness list, then you have a problem. And you have to worry about everything that you've done to that point being subject to questioning at a deposition or being disclosed under the expert disclosure rules. So as long as you and the retaining attorney are on the same page as far as what your defined role is by the attorney, you're going to be fine. You run into a real problem, though, if you think you're just consulting and then you find out later that the attorney has listed you as an potential expert witness and your deposition is now scheduled for 7 days hence.
Excellent. We're running low on time, but let me throw an ethics question out. I'm on the NACFA Ethics Oversight Board, and this comes up. So professional standards require integrity and objectivity in providing our services, and this requires that our opinions be developed free of bias. Now, do we compromise our integrity and objectivity if we advocate for our client?
Well, I guess I'd wonder what you mean by advocating, because merely getting up to speed, appearing in court, testifying as a witness at trial, and then doing the work necessary beforehand, like appearing as a witness at deposition, to me, that's not advocacy, because we've talked about this many times before. The highest role of an expert is to fulfill the duty to the trier of fact and to the court to be as objective as necessary. Now, I know there are lots of experts who will come in and say whatever their retaining attorney wants them to say, but we in the legal profession treat expert witnesses as people who are especially responsible and beholden to the court for objectivity. Now, when you are working with an attorney to work a case up for trial, and you're doing that on a consulting basis rather than as a prospective witness, I think then you can coach and help and make suggestions and anything you like in the nature of advocacy, but it has to be purely informal.
I would just add to that or reinforce that by saying, like we've been saying, there's an old saying, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. and the answer to do we compromise our integrity if we advocate, I couldn't agree more. And I thought Judge H raised the question I would have raised if he hadn't, which is, what do you mean by advocate? Expert witnesses are not viewed by the judiciary and shouldn't be unless they dig their own grave on this issue as advocates. That's not their job. Their job is to be an expert witness in the case. It may well be they wouldn't be there if their opinion didn't happen to coincide with hiring counsel and his or her client's position, but they're not there as advocates to make arguments. And as long as they understand that, and there's another, I guess, almost cliche, the mentor of mine, who was an expert witness in many cases, said, "Be a little slow to know." There's nothing wrong with admitting on the stand, particularly if your opinion is just that, an opinion. That is your opinion. You feel very strongly about it. Here's how you developed it. But I acknowledge that there are people who think otherwise, and you'll probably hear from them after I get through, if I get off the stand. And that's actually persuasive, because anyone that says I'm right and that's the end of that discussion is not going to be very persuasive, at least not to most of us.
Right.
We know the world is not that certain.
Thank you. That's good advice. During mediation, can experts calculate multiple valuations based on averaging elements of both sides and offer those calculations to the mediator? And then do the compromise values then become the new opinions of that expert?
Ellen, I think that it's actually helpful to have multiple valuations if you're trying to reach a resolution in a case. And there's a rule of evidence that says the statements made in settlement negotiations are inadmissible. Now, you have to be a little careful about making sure that that applies to you going in. But to my mind, I would always protect you if you were just playing around with possibilities during the course of a mediation, trying to come at the problem from different methods of valuation and offering different options. So Judge Platt may have a different view than I do, but I always jealously guard settlement negotiations. And anytime somebody tries to get them in a trial, unless the rule absolutely requires me to admit that evidence, I will not allow it.
Well, when I act as a mediator, I have a part of my standard agreement when I'm a private mediator is that I can't be called as a witness. So that answers my question, my position on that issue contractually.
When the retaining attorney asks the expert to provide multiple calculations,
Sure.
Does that jeopardize independence and objectivity? And are they discoverable if we're doing that work for a retaining attorney?
I don't think that it shows weakness or uncertainty or anything like that. Whether it's subject to disclosure during discovery is a different problem. And it may very well be that if you're asked at a deposition, how many different methods of valuation did you employ in this case? And what were the results of each one of those inquiries? Then you may have to answer the questions.
I was referring to way beyond that, because that's in the report. That's part of our work. But if the retaining attorney asks, well, what if you changed your cap rate? What if you changed an assumption here and there?
Sure.
And you do that for the retaining attorney so they can see the range of issues.
Right. Yep. I see what you're saying. Look, I think that you can ask about that at deposition in the same way that you can ask about that at trial. There's nothing wrong. An expert can answer hypothetical questions, and changing the cap rate is just another hypothetical question.
Right.
But I would just be sure that either when you're asking those questions at deposition, you be allowed to clarify that you don't think the cap rate should be changed, or more importantly, it's up to your retaining attorney to clean that up during the deposition, because that sort of thing goes on at trial all the time. I mean, you have opposing counsel get up and make some ridiculous assumption. Well, let's assume that interest rates go to 25% a year. Then what happens to your calculation? And in most instances, well, of course, the whole thing blows up, but that's not going to happen. And you as the expert should be allowed to explain that it won't happen and why it won't happen.
Judge Platt, do you want to comment? Because I have one last slide. And then
no, other than I agree with everything that was said, don't have anything to add to it.
Somebody raised the question of who is the client when the expert offers settlement consulting services. And our standards require that the client be defined in order to comply with the consulting standards. And generally, that is the person engaging the expert. But when the expert offers consulting services to the mediator or the party's attorneys, well, then who is the client? What do you think of that?
What I think of it is if whoever hired you is paying you and you have a written contract, that should answer that question. And if the role includes offering consulting services to someone other than the client, i.e. the mediator or the other party's attorney, that should also be in there.
And if I were in that circumstance, I would always strongly prefer to be the client of every party involved in the case. If I'm going to act in any sort of consulting capacity, or even more so as a mediator, I don't know how Judge Platt structures all of his fee arrangements, but I would be willing to bet in 99 out of 100, he is retained by both sides or all sides.
And I would also, that is true. And I would also make sure that that is very clear, again, preferably in writing, because when somebody hears an opinion they don't like, they're going to have a whole bunch of reasons to question the motives and the ethics and everything else. Yep. And you don't want to be on the receiving end of that discussion.
Judge Platt, Judge Yates, thank you very, very much. And if Michael Mike Kaplan, if he's online, I wanted to ask, because he's going to be involved with your discussion after this program. But Mike, in your experiences as a forensic expert, what stands out most important in evaluation or financial expert can do to assist in the settlement of cases? Are you there?
I am here.
Oh, great. Okay.
I'm here and I'm ready to answer your question. And it's a very hot topic in my mind. Number one, I believe an expert should never lose sight of the fact that his or her role includes positioning counsel to get this case settled. You know, we learn how to value businesses. We learn how to measure lost profits. We learn how to do a damages study. We learn the technical aspects of building a discount rate or doing research and bringing it all together. But and this is something that I've maintained for a long time, one thing that's been missing from our education is what we need to know about getting a case settled. Remember, after we learn all that technical stuff, then we prepare for battle, how to be effective in a deposition, how to be effective in a trial. If we can start thinking in terms of getting the case resolved, and that's why we're there to get the case resolved. Sometimes it goes into the courtroom and sometimes it doesn't. I believe that the expert needs to have heart-to-heart conversations with retaining counsel and as appropriate with counsel's client about the realities of taking that case into the courtroom and putting expert testimony on, and the other guy's going to put expert testimony on. And often you never know where it's going to go and the importance of evaluating that case.
Michael, we have to go. The hook is on us.
Oh, okay. Very good. Pay attention to positioning the case for settlement. You'll do your retaining counsel and their clients a huge service, and the court system. Oh, and please, we have this upcoming session on the in-depth session on the judges panel today. Please join us. And if you join us, there is a code in your materials to get a 20% discount if you register today. And it's
Thank you, Michael, and to the judges too, and to Alan. So as Michael mentioned, you have also in the chat, you will have your discount and the link to register for the seminar that is after the program. And now you have your polling questions, so make sure to respond to that. And now we have Michael Mulder. He's going to be talking about federal and state case law summaries. And you know him already. He's one of our correspondents, and he's with us every couple of months. So, Michael?
Thank you, Alina.
Mulder.
I hope everybody can hear me. I think I got myself off mute.
Yes.
And I would
yes,
like to
we can-
apologize up front that somebody's doing some work out in the street and the dog is going bananas. So if you hear the barking, that's what's going on. That's me. The case we're talking about today is SDSP LLC versus Adius. It is a case out of the Superior Court of Pennsylvania, which is the first tier appellate court in Pennsylvania. The case involves calculation of damages in unjust enrichment. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, unjust enrichment is one of several quasi-contract remedies that are equitable remedies that you can take advantage of when you have what you think is a contractual arrangement, but something falls through or it is not a valid contract. And so we'll talk about this particular one. This is a construction case. So the plaintiffs, SDSP, were a real estate development company based in, I think, Brooklyn, somewhere up in the New York area. And they purchased a surplus high school from the Philadelphia School District with the intention of turning it into an apartment building. And that is the project that we'll be talking about. They created several entities. One owned the project, one operated as the general contractor for the project. There were a couple others that they created to do various aspects of developing the project. The general contractor entity employed 3 to 5 people, but only had one person who was actually on site. Again, this is a New York-based company. Okay. So all of the other other than the one person who was on site, everybody else was working out of the New York office. This was also the only project this developer had done outside of, well, most of their work was in the metropolitan New York City area. They had a couple other projects in further out in New York, but this is the only one that wasn't a New York project. So they started out the first phase of the project was to do demolition work. They weren't happy with the contractor they had hired, and then they hired the defendant. And they really liked the work the defendant was doing. And they decided to bring the defendant's other entities, other construction entities, into the project on various subcontracts for, I think they worked on plumbing. There was a masonry business they had. I forget all of them. In the end, it was a total of 11 contracts, or contracts with 11 entities that were either owned by or controlled by Mr. Adius. And as frequently happens in construction cases, there are delays, and there's payment disputes, and then there's disputes over what the scope of the project was and whether something was done right or whether it was within the scope of the contract. And all of that led to the defendant being terminated. So the plaintiff sued the defendant for breach of contract, unjust enrichment, and my favorite part of this particular case was there's a conversion claim arising out of an allegation that apparently the judge ultimately decided was accurate, that the defendant, Mr. Adius, had taken a bunch of kitchen cabinets that had been ordered and paid for by the plaintiff for the project and used them in something else he was working on. The defendant counterclaimed for breach of contract and unjust enrichment because there was a number of aspects of the construction work that he had done that were beyond the scope of the contract itself, and he was looking to get paid for them. Ultimately, the trial court found for the defendant on everything related to the construction project. The only thing that he gave to the plaintiff was the claim for conversion. So, like I said, apparently they established that he did in fact steal the cabinets. Both sides appealed, and I'm going through this quickly because we're really behind. The appeal focus, the appellate decision focused primarily on defendant's unjust enrichment claim. And it ended up reversing the trial court's decision because in unjust enrichment cases, the value of damages is not driven by what the claimant thinks something should be. It's not. So the decision in the trial court involved a lot of evidence about how much the defendant put into doing this additional work. And they had an expert who was comparing the ultimate as-built construction to the original architectural plans, and he did an estimation of the cost of the labor and the cost of the materials for that difference in scope. Excuse me. And the appellate court reversed that, saying that, and this is something to carry through into any time you're engaged with an unjust enrichment claim, is the damage for unjust enrichment has nothing to do with what it cost the plaintiff or the claimant, because in this case it was the defendant making a claim. It has nothing to do with what the claimant is saying. It cost me all this to provide these services. It has to do with the value that the respondent, again, in this case, that's the plaintiff, the value that they received from the work that was done, and that they unjustly retained, the value they unjustly retained in accepting that work that was done on their behalf. And again, I want to try and get through this quickly. There's a great quote in materials. It is a common issue in construction cases, but it doesn't come up only in construction cases. I am actually involved in an employment case asserting an unjust enrichment claim. Same issue. It's the value that, in that case, it's the plaintiff asserting the unjust enrichment claim. And the issue for damages is it's the value that of the benefit received by the defendant in the plaintiff having done the work. And I think I've gotten us back on schedule. As always, and I'll tell you this every week, I blew through this quickly. If you'd like to have a further conversation about it, reach out. If you'd like to learn a bit more about quasi-contract claims and the measure of damages in those cases, shoot me an email, give me a call, whatever. I'm happy to help.
Michael, thank you so much for your presentation and this case. Really helpful, really helpful. That moves us into our last segment of our program, and this is with Garrett Wagner. Garrett, you there?
I am here.
All right. Garrett's going to be is part of the C3 evolution. Is going to talk about growing your brand, growing and building your brand. So I'll let you take it away and give us the goods that you have, the goodness you have.
Do you have the slides, or I need to show the slides?
You show the slides.
All right, Amy, what's that? This is the first for me. Usually when I do these, you're running so late that I've got like 30 seconds. I've never had this much time on one of these before. I'm like, what do I do now?
What do you do? You planned a 30-second presentation, and now you got your full time now.
Yeah, it's a first. So welcome everybody. You know, like I said, this last piece is very different from anything that came before. That was all kind of technical information.
We don't see your slides yet.
Oh, sorry. See, usually we're so late we don't even get to that. It's just like it's like a first time thing. All right, can you see them now?
There you go.
All right. Let me also mute my notifications here. So we're going to talk about, like I said, how can we help you grow your practice? You've got all this great information. NACVA's provided you this framework, these tools. How do you get there? How do you got to take this knowledge and go find those clients? How to use the things that we talked about today? So let's go ahead. I'm going to get to some key points, because I was like focus back on what we learned today, because you're kind of one of the challenges is like, what do you talk about? What do you tell people? What do you tell prospect clients, whether it's attorneys or business associates, wherever it is? What's your story you want to tell them? Even today, they covered so much amazing knowledge. So if you're trying to think, hey, like, how do I grow my practice? How do I get more work? Well, today, was there something that was more interesting to you that you can kind of dig into it a little more nuanced? Because a lot of what I hear from successful NACVA members is, they've kind of found their niche in their practice area. The judge was just talking at the end there, lost profit analysis. And he kind of said, hey, I can go on and on about that. Well, maybe if you're listening to that, you're like, hey, like that's interesting to me. Like that nuance, that niche area that you can kind of just own. And then you can build out your practice around there. There's forensic work. Obviously, they've got the valuation work, stuff with the economy. So there's so many pieces. So as you're thinking about like, how do I market my practice? As we talk some questions, think through like what interests you today that we talked about. What are the spots you're like, you know what? That topic was actually interesting to me. Like I would be happy to help people with that. You've got the constant one, divorce, litigation, those ones too. If that's something that interests you, okay, great. You're gonna build a practice around divorce work. Okay, what is it? What is it going to be? So kind of think of that as a first step of like, what are you going to get into with this? And I'm going to fast forward a few slides here. So we can get to the meat and potatoes of it because I got time today. So we're going to talk about it. As we go, if you got questions, let me know. But this is what we help people work through. We go through this exercise with people real time or at conference and events. We want you to kind of think through that first stage, just kind of like that first step of any process. What makes you different as a practitioner? What makes your practice just different? And we've got some common questions to think about up here. You should be able to answer these. What is your value proposition? Your why? What makes you different? And why should somebody hire you? Because if you don't know kind of where you're going and how you want to market and promote your practice, that's where we see a lot of practitioners kind of get in trouble. They try and be the best at everything. They do a little bit of this, they do a little bit of that, whatever kind of like comes through the door. And sometimes over time, things kind of like align themselves and you find yourself in this niche practice area and you take off. But you can really accelerate that if you kind of hone in on like, what is it? What is it that brought you to the NACVA? And what is it that makes you want to focus in this area? There's so many different solutions, so many different reasons. So think about for you, what is your why? Why did you choose to take this path? What makes you different? Why should somebody hire you? And think about that. Take this slide, think it over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 days. You got questions, reach out to me, ask me. I'm happy to help. But you got to start at this first phase of like, why did you take this path? Because if you don't know where you're going, it's all going to fall apart later on. So we got to get that good, solid foundation to begin with. So when we kind of talk about like value proposition, some ways to kind of think about, there's three kind of key core areas. One, product leadership. Do you want to be the best in the area? 2, customer intimacy. Do you want to know your customers the best? And operational excellence. Do you want to be that low cost provider? All three work well. All three can be done in the space. You can be very, very successful doing just like high net worth divorce, large business forensic work. Or on the flip side, this operational excellence, if you want to be the person that can get affordable, quick valuations done for like small business clientele, there's a huge market for that. Because I'm still a practicing CPA. We have clients all the time, and I hear from practitioners all the time that, clients want a valuation, usually not for legal purposes, for their own like questions, but they can't pay for like the full gamut. Hey, if you want to focus on that, like I'm able to trim this all down and do it much more economical, kind of like Walmart, you can have a great practice in that area. There's a ton of different ways you can take it. You just got to think about which one works for you. And I see there's a bunch of questions coming in on the polling questions, and I'm sure someone will help get to that. So that's kind of step one, thinking about who you are. Okay, what you want to be. What's your narrative? Why are you there? Step 2, how do you look, feel, and act differently? What's the perception of the customers of you? What do you want it to be? Is it, hey, I'm this casual solo practitioner? Okay, if so, that works a little bit better if you're kind of that low-cost provider. If you're kind of that ultimate high-end niche work, what does everything then kind of fit around that? Does your brand, your persona, your packaging, everything you do kind of fit around that like I am the expert in this niche area. I know my stuff. My fees might be super high, but I'm worth it because this is what I'm good at. This is what I'm known for, and this is my focus. So kind of that's why I said step one's important. Which of those buckets you're going to be and who you're going to be. Once you know who you want to be, you can start to think about drilling it down to that next level. And some great examples on here. We got content marketing and thought leadership, which we're going to talk about next. These are great ways that you can reach your clientele, your target audience in a very impactful way. It's not a salesy way, but it's really focusing on giving them the information they need. Okay. So you get seen as the expert. And NACFA's got a ton of resources to help you get there along the way. So content marketing is very similar to what NACFA is doing right here today. They're producing amazing content from great experts that you're tuning in to recognize their value, to say, wow, like these people in these different topics are experts in different areas. And that's what it's about. So for you, if you say, hey, I really want to focus in on forensic work and the forensic work in a specific industry, or where I live, the forensic work tends to be in this practice area. I work at a place with, I heard the judge talk about real estate transactions and lost profits. There's a ton of construction going on right now, a ton of these type of cases happening, a ton of lost profit analysis. That this is a common thing. Great. How do I get into that? How do I think about it? How do I figure it out? Just look at that. Someone raised their hand. I'm not sure what that means. If you've got a question, please ask. I can't tell from the hand raising what you are looking at. So think about this as the content marketing side. If you know what you want to talk about, how can you do it? And there's way more easy ways today than ever before. Frankly, there's a number of groups out there that you can work with, you can outsource to, and et cetera, and work with you to pull it together very affordably to figure out, hey, what is that message I want to send? Do I want to put out an email blast, a webinar, a YouTube show, a live event, whatever it is? The nice thing nowadays, in a very economical way, and we do this for my company ourselves, you can outsource a lot of that content creation to others. Now, in your industry niche expertise, you might have to do kind of like the nitty-gritty analysis and the laws, but they can kind of help turn that into a more easy to understand, easy to get piece. And this for me is the fun part. When you think about like content marketing, it's really about, okay, if I know my target audience, if I know I'm really trying to work with, I'm going to do marital work, divorce work. Okay, who are the lawyers in town that do this type of work? How do I get in front of them? What's the best way to reach them? Here's my list. I've got 50 people, 10 people, 100 people, whatever it is. I know who it is. I know what I want them to know about me. And I know how I want to position myself. Okay. Where do they go for their information? What information are they looking for? Are they struggling to find someone that can do the litigation support work for divorces? Or they just need another valuation expert? Or what is it? You got to put your problem solving hat on and kind of think through, like, who's that target audience? What do I need to get in front of them? What's that carrot that's going to make them say, wow, like I keep hearing about this great stuff from this person. So if I need an expert in this area, I'm going to reach out to them. Because as you know, anyone that's done this before, a lot of areas, especially like the litigation side, the lawyers, they're experts in kind of everything, but they're not financial experts. They know enough, and they kind of sometimes pretend a little more than they know, but you can kind of come and be like, hey, I know you work a lot in this space. I've looked at some of the cases you've tried before, some of the settlements you reach, whatever you can find from public record. I'm seeing some red flags here. I'm seeing some things that you should watch out for. Or do you do a great piece like, top 3 things all divorce attorneys should know on the financial side? Most commonly missed financial errors that are out there to help save your clients money. Whatever it is, if it's on the valuation side, top 3 divorce tips for valuing a small privately held company, because that's a big one all that time. Those small business valuations, what are they? How do they do? Whatever your expertise is, like I said, you got to start with, why am I doing this? What is it? And you kind of whittle it down. And eventually at this step, you start to think about your audience and how do you reach them and how do you talk to them? So, some common examples like I just talked about. There's a bunch up here. This is how you got to do it. It's a big shift from in the past, kind of going to like networking events and things like that. That's kind of you're going out there, you're trying to meet someone, get in front of them. Now, if you're in a small community and you only got a handful of lawyers that you're looking to reach out to, that could be a good strategy. But if you're living in a spot where you're saying, hey, like my target clients are diverse, or they're not coming together a lot, I can't get these lawyers in a room. They're not already going to a room for some event. Because let's face this, a lot of us, myself included, are going to way less networking events now in 2023 than we did 5, 6, 10 years ago. So it's hard to kind of find people in a room. When they do, they're not always looking for that kind of hard sales pitch. But that's where you got to come in thinking through, like, what is it? How do I want to get it? One of the things that we've started to do is we work with accounting firms to do this primarily. Some of them say, like, this is great, Garrett. I want to do a lot in the blog space, the vlog, the podcast, whatever that is. But like, man, I don't want to do it at all. Like, that scares me. I don't want to kind of do what you're seeing people here do, get up on camera. So we've kind of started to outsource that role for them. I'll say, hey, you know what? You're looking to be the seat of this expert. We'll bring somebody else in. Essentially kind of that talking voice that can pick them up and go through these topics to help them get that right answer. Because not everybody kind of wants to like be on camera, host a podcast, do things like that. So it's just something else to think about on this marketing side. There's a million ways that you can market yourself and grow your brand really successfully, really quickly. And that's what I enjoy about it for all of us like accountants and CPAs. It's still a problem to be solved. It's just like doing that valuation, the texture of the audit. There's a little bit of like problem solving to it. And it's not as complicated as it seems. Once you start doing it, just like anybody that's done a valuation before, the 100th valuation is not as hard as the first. For a lot of accountants, marketing, we're like phase 1. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. Whereas people that have done it before, they're on step 100. Okay, this is great. It's another time. Just like a valuation, here's how I do it. I've got my checklist. I've got my process. I'm ready to go from the start to the finish and build you out a great plan. Because that's the great thing about everybody here on this webinar. You're doing something truly of value and truly important and different than all those just cut-of-the-mill CPAs out there. You just got to find your path. Why do you want to do this? What kind of work do you want to focus on? And then get people to hear you, get people to see you as that expert, and you're not going to look back. So with that, any final questions before I turn it back over to the moderator? Saying I think the last polling question is up on the screen.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is, Garrett. Thank you for the presentation. I think this is a big area that we as experts need to take and realize it's part of our business model is this marketing and putting ourselves out there and setting some things up. So with that, I want to close out our program today and know that we've got the next program, same time at 11 o'clock Mountain Time on October 16th. We will see you there. And for those of you that haven't done so already, check out the conference in December. I will be there in Fort Lauderdale speaking too. So I hope to see you all there. In the meantime, you guys have an incredible day, an incredible month.